Hey guys, I want to make this video. Uh, I recently had a family member pass away, and I wanted to talk about why that happens and, how what makes us grow older quicker than we should a lot of times. I see it happens in family members, and maybe you guys have probably witnessed family members who feel like they grew older way sooner than they needed to, right? I think it's pretty simple, but it's the way in which we do it to ourselves is very complicated. Uh, and it's most of the time it's unconscious, right? We're not consciously trying to kill ourselves, but we do, right? I think the easiest way, I mean, the way it's written in the Bible is pretty simple. It's, from dust to dust, right? If we eat from the ground, then it'll suck us back up. But if we do it we can die at a much younger age, if we don't take care of ourselves. And a lot of times, we point it to chemical addictions and stuff, but that's all, manifestations of deeper issues. If we've got a lot of emotional trauma that's tied to certain things, then it pulls us down, right? We try to numb negative emotional states with alcohol, of course, is one of the leading ones in the world, because alcohol actually sucks moisture out of your body and it actually numbs you to your emotional states. But then you have to go through a bunch of stuff just to rehydrate, right? And so the pain of rehydrating or the hangover period is pretty rough, right? I mean, we basically, you pay the price for numbing yourself, and some people just can't get away from it, right? Binge alcoholism, where you're can't stop drinking, is pretty rough. There's generational trauma wrapped up in that, because there's so many, we think so negatively about ourselves. That's what gets projected onto the world around us. So it's really easy, and I fall into this daily, to think negatively about that. Just the fact that, that's the hardest thing to overcome, is when you can see it for what it is, and how it's being manifested, to keep from thinking negatively about that. Right? I mean, it's part of growth. It's part of the animal nature to feed on itself, but how do we grow out of that? Right? How do we stop feeding off one another and start living more harmoniously together? I don't know. That's a deeper issue that I'm not going to cover in this video, but I just wanted to tell you guys how I remember him. He was my mom's younger brother. He was born 50. Actually, he died just before he turned 74 this year, because he was born in November. I think November 20th, if I remember right, at the memorial yesterday. My Uncle Phil was awesome to me. When I was growing up, I never got along with my dad very well. My dad wasn't there when I was born, and he never got along with his older brothers. So me being the firstborn, never tried to connect with me. I was only, he connected with my younger brother, who was only a year younger than me. And so when I was a early teen, and my Uncle Phil and Aunt Mary moved into this area about the time I was 14. They had been living in California, and Phil had been working for Lockheed Martin. Phil was extremely smart, very good at everything he did, but like the rest of the people in the family, carrying a lot of emotional baggage, and it manifested itself in either drinking or overeating, or one of the two. Right? It was always one of the two. Mom and her younger brother Mike were overeaters and sugar addicts, and Phil and Grandpa were heavy drinkers. Both of those are an emotional attachment. But Phil was very smart, so I got along with Phil really well. Phil and I got along really good, and but because of drinking, him and my cousin Bill, who is just less than month older than me and my cousin were born about the same time, in 1975. He was born in January, I was born in February. And so he was one of the first cousins that I remember playing with when I was a kid. But I felt more comfortable at Uncle Phil's house. For one thing, Uncle Phil cooked nonstop. He made more different kinds of soups and chilies and things like that than just about anybody I ever knew. He'd be, drinking, making something. It's like, hey, what's for dinner? I mean, he'd always make sure to make enough so that whoever showed up could eat. And you didn't want to look in the back fridge. There was a back fridge that was super packed with just stuff that was getting pretty old usually because he cooked so much food. He always tried to make sure that there was enough food there for everybody, and he generally didn't like to throw stuff out, especially if it tasted good, and he was a good cook. One of my buddies at the memorial said, yeah, he said, to this day, one of the soups that he made is still his favorite soup that he's ever tasted. Amazing. It's just so good. So he was also the first one. Well, I think we were 14 years old. It was about that time. It was like late 80s, 1989, somewhere in there. He wanted to take us hunting because we'd never been hunting before. And in Washington State, you needed to have a hunter's permit, but you had to take the class. So my brother Ken and Bill and he enrolled us in a class in Pasco, I believe. And we took a hunter safety course so that we could get our hunter's license. And so then we went deer hunting that fall. And I remembered that going in there to the memorial just because it's this time of year. And it was the first and last time that I saw my grandfather or my mom's dad, Phil's dad, go hunting. He grew up in a time in the 30s and 40s where hunting it wasn't recreational. It was something that you needed to do to survive. And so he never saw hunting as a recreational thing, which is why it was the only time that we got him out to go hunting or something like that. It's interesting when you think about it. So many people lived in survival mode in the 30s and 40s that it was a whole different mentality, right? And which is why things weren't generally fun. The things that we could think of as being fun now were like chores. They were daily tasks that needed to be done. A lot of people take up hobbies, like, they start weaving or making clothes or things like that. Those things weren't hobbies 150 years ago. Those were mandatory tasks that a lot of people just didn't like to do. Some people enjoyed it, but, something like hunting was something that was not something that was generally considered to be fun, but we've carried that tradition over. Anyway, we didn't get a deer that weekend. I was actually the only one. I spooked a big muley doe standing right next to me. Came out of the bushes. I'm literally like 10 feet away from me, and she was surprised to see me because I was just standing there, and she looked at me for a second, and then she ran off. And it was really actually, I always have remembered that experience. It was very surreal. It was also the only time that I sat around the campfire with my Uncle Phil and my brother and my cousin Bill and heard my grandpa talk about Sweden. He was a first generation Swede. His dad came over from Sweden. He was much older. Grandpa was born in 1930, and his dad was born in 1879. So he was already 21 years old by 1900. So he was 51 years old when Grandpa was born. And he died in the 50s. So he died 20 years before I was born. So I never saw my great-grandfather. old Swede. But Grandpa still had some of the language. Grandpa cooked some of the best Swedish meatballs, but it was the only time, because Phil asked us some direct questions about Sweden, that we heard stories about Sweden. I wish I could have recorded that night, because I've forgotten so much. I mean, I was 14 years old. That was, 35 years ago. So, but that was my Uncle Phil. The memories that I had of him were, regardless of, maybe he was, because he would get belligerent, and he was a staunch Republican, a Democrat hater, you could say. Watched Fox News every day, I love football. But he was somebody that really was deeply into economics and really looked at the exterior reality, focused on material things. Had a shopping addiction, like my mother. My mother had a shopping addiction. Always trying to get the new thing, right? Because if you're not feeling good about yourself, and a lot of times we look to the external world as to making ourselves happy. This is one reason why I have avoided, in a lot of ways, the business community in so many ways, because they're always looking at, it feels to me like we always look at the external and try and believe that that's gonna, change the internal, when the exact opposite is true. Because the more you focus on the external, and the more you try to make the external affect this, then, because the external changes nonstop, and the more it goes like this, the more you go, and then the more fear of not having something out there creates a negative state internally. And I saw it negatively affect my Uncle Phil. He had so much stuff. At one time, I think he had over like 50 chainsaws. He just loved chainsaws. And it's like, ooh, if he saw a deal, he'd buy a deal. And one day he came over, he brought over this big, it was an Echo MS610, I believe. Big chainsaw. And he's like, Mary told me I can't keep any more chainsaws, so I got to give you this one. So he gave me this big chainsaw, and I had already bought another chainsaw from him just previously, because I didn't have one. So I bought a smaller steel Farm Boss. I think it was like I can't remember what size it was, 960 or something. I don't know. It was it was a 29. It was an 029. That's what it was. I still have it. Good saw. Recently rebuilt it. Excellent saw. But yeah, I enjoyed spending the time with my Uncle Phil. And unfortunately, and this is something that I saw and witnessed, when we get too concerned about the things that we can't control, it pushes us away from one another, and we spend less time with one another. In the last 4 years, I invited my Uncle Phil to dinner every night, because his daughter lived on the west side. Bill and him weren't they never really got along very well. And one thing that happened at the memorial is Bill said that they really came to terms with each other the day before he died. And it kills you, right? If you're too concerned about the external. Bill said that, and he loved guns. He collected guns. He had over 30 Model 94 Winchesters. I'm not sure if you guys know what that is. It's the kind of the standard lever action. That Model 94, I think, was the first lever action that had that type of lever that came back on the top and then went in. And he had every caliber for it. Winchester made so many different calibers in that Model 94. But 30-30 was the most common. So that was the 30-30. Model 94 was made for years in the 50s, 60s, 70s that people used. And it was called Model 94 because it came out in 1894. Winchester made that. And it was so popular because it was such a good lever action that worked so well that there were a lot of collectors of Model 94 Winchesters. He had all kinds of, even like collector editions of Model 94 Winchesters and 44 mag and different calibers and so many different things. Uh, he collected them. He bought and sold them. And when the law changed in Washington State, we got to where you could sell a gun privately to somebody else. You had to go through a broker. And so the taxes and the fees that were involved negated the whole how easy it was, and the background checks negated the whole ease of how easy it was just to even move one of the things. So he could have taken them to Idaho and unloaded them, because Idaho is still a state where you can just sell privately and there's nothing they can do about it, or they don't try to regulate it in some way, because in Idaho they already know that people kill people, guns don't kill people. Right? But Washington State's a little bit different, because you've got Seattle and that mentality of way of thinking over there. When you're forced to live off the land and communities work together, they already understand that guns are a part of life, and they, or have been for so long, that especially when you've got a national government that falsely inputs a breed of wolf in the area that's not native to the region, that starts decimating the elk and deer populations in the area, which is a true story. When I used to go to Elk River, where my grandpa grew up, and the reason I'm talking about this is because this is directly related to my Uncle Phil. We would go back there all the time. It was where all we were from, and we would vacation in that part of Idaho. When we would go there, there were elk and deer everywhere. Just the 20-minute drive from Beauville to Elk River, you'd see at least one herd of elk standing on the side of the road. Everywhere. But after sometime in the 90s, when they transplanted a big timber wolf, a big Canadian timber wolf that never existed before in that area. And it's not like we had, Idaho's got a lot of wilderness area, but nothing like Canada. Canada's so big. There's literally so much wilderness area that something like a big timber wolf can survive and not negatively impact elk populations and deer populations or moose populations. But in that part of Idaho, yeah, they do. And it's moose included, because we have moose there too. And so the locals would see fresh moose kills all the time, and there's less moose, less elk, and less deer in total by quite a bit because of the wolves. And so now Idaho pretty much has an open shoot policy on those wolves, and they've openly stated within the last couple of years that they're actively going after the wolves that they themselves put there. As the wolf population just blew up out of control and started negatively impacting everything else. So this is besides the issue. I mean, I'm just talking and rambling, because I do love my family, and it's one thing that's one of the hardest things to deal with, right? Is when you really love your family and you love people that you've met or you've gotten close to people, and they're worried about too much other stuff where you can't connect and just connect at the deepest level, and where their number one priority is just spending time together, and forget about being afraid of anything else. Unfortunately, Phil had gotten COVID quite a few times and was afraid of going out, and so it got worse. Anytime you isolate yourself in a box, you're going to get sicker and sicker. You can call it COVID, you can call it whatever you want, but you'll just get sicker and sicker. And so he collected guns. He collected a lot of gold and silver. And I don't know how much gold and silver because when the cops showed up, they confiscated pretty much everything, because there was no will. And even if there was a will, there was 108 guns inside of a small apartment. I didn't find out that number until I talked to Bill at the memorial. They were wondering, well, they're having a hard time with it, just to the sheer volume of checking all the numbers to make sure that they're not stolen or whatever. Not only that, but they were wondering how that they weren't, somebody didn't contact them if somebody had that many guns in one apartment. And it's not a mystery, right? It's not and a lot of people don't understand this. In this area, you can carry a handful of guns and nobody cares, right? There might be one person out of 100 that's going to say, "Oh, what's that person doing?" But right, people kill people. Guns don't kill people. I mean, there are people in this town that have basements with 10,000 rounds ammunition for about probably 10 different calibers. An armory of weapons. But, you're killing yourself by doing that. Why would you, I mean, that's a pretty expensive hobby. And are you really worried about dying? Right? You can't take any of that stuff with you. I got to be perfectly honest. I haven't been afraid of dying for quite some time. And I think it's probably why I feel as young as I do. Right? It's the dichotomy there, right? If you're afraid of dying, you'll die quicker. If you're not afraid of dying, you won't die. The fear, right? Call it fear, but you're creating your own reality. And if you can get away from the idea of trying to create something in the future. Now, we can have visions, and I have visions. I have my own visions of a future, of a place where we're just living together in peace and doing what we need to do for one another and not worrying about the external at all, to make sure that we're all being taken care of so we can spend time together and enjoy nature together. Nature is much more interesting than what we've created here, Yeah. So I just wanted to give this little short spiel about my Uncle Phil because I felt like I needed to at least get it out of my system that I'll miss him in the physical, but he's here. I know he's here. I've died enough times to know that this isn't the end. We just keep coming back. I just did a video, about Groundhog Day. We keep coming back over and over and over, whether we like it or not, till we figure out how to not do it as many times or as often, and we maybe enjoy it a little bit better when we are here. Love you guys. Have a wonderful day, and we'll catch you on the next one.